What are human beings that God is mindful of us? Will Rogers once said, God made us just a little lower than the angels, and we've been getting lower ever since. Winston Churchill reportedly said, I like pigs. Dogs look up to us. Cats look down on us. Pigs treat us as equals. And the legendary broadcaster, Walter Cronkite, reportedly once reported that the luxury car maker Rolls-Royce was having a recall campaign because, he said, Rolls-Royce announced today that it is recalling Rolls-Royce cars because of faulty nuts behind the steering wheel. I'm not making this up. What are we that God is mindful of us? Some years ago, I was serving as a pastor of a church in Atlanta, and I learned that a classmate of mine was also serving a church in Atlanta. We met together for lunch, and he, being African American, invited me to become part of a group called the Concerned Black Clergy of Atlanta. Well, I'm clergy. I'm concerned. I think I'm sort of peach color. But I was invited, and I was welcomed, and they were very kind and gracious. This room filled with the most prominent African-American pastors in Atlanta and me. Who am I that they were mindful of me? After a while, there was actually a meeting where the leader of the group stood up and in his remarks announced that I was one of the founders of the Concerned Black Clergy, which obviously I was not. Who am I that he was mindful of me? And there was an incident that happened there I will never forget. I was walking down the hall to go to the meeting, and who was standing in the hall but the civil rights icon, Congressman John Lewis. He came up to me, reached out his hand, and said, I'm glad to meet you. Who am I that this civil rights icon was mindful of me? But the psalm says that the very creator of the universe is mindful of us. The psalm declares that we were made just a little lower than the angels, and that God crowned us with glory and honor. And if that wasn't enough, God has given us dominion over the earth. And in the midst of all of these proclamations, somehow angels are mentioned. A few years ago, America seemed fascinated with angels. Remember that TV program, what was the name of it, Touched by an Angel? And then there was a movie called Michael, which was about an archangel. And there were a bunch of books published about angels. Billy Graham wrote one called Angels, God's Secret Agents. And angel pins just seem to be everywhere. But that fad has passed, and now what we're reduced to is what the Bible says about angels. It does say that we're just a little lower than angels, and that Jesus was far above the angels, but somehow Jesus gave up that privilege to be with us. And this gets into some complicated theology that I'm not well equipped to explain. But here is what I think is the most important thing. All we need to understand of these words of Hebrew is where it says, when we see Jesus, the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. That's really all we need to see. All we need to know is that God in the flesh came with us, walked with us, lived with us. There's a story about Queen Elizabeth II that I like. One of the Queen's favorite things to do is at her place in Sandringham, which was a country estate that the monarchs have owned for about a century and a half, just to be able to go out and wander around in the wind and the rain with her little Welsh corgis. But sometimes she'll go into town. And one time she was in town shopping, and a woman came up to her and said that she looked very much like the Queen. The Queen said, "Well, that's very reassuring." What does God look like? What does God look like? The closest we have, and what we have, and the precious thing we have, is to see him in the face of Jesus of Nazareth. And there we get a glimpse. In his love, we find love. In his grace, we find grace. In his power, we find heavenly power, far above the angels, power above our own. The writer of Hebrews said that not only is Christ the power above the angels, but a power within each one of us. He was the one who traveled the same road we travel. He faced the same vulnerability, the same temptations, the same sufferings that we each face. He is the pioneer who has led the way. He made it so we are able to follow in that way. And he can bring us to a place we cannot bring ourselves to unless he goes with us. I can't say I really understand that, but I know I believe it. And I believe that in believing it, it makes all the difference.